My dad asked for hot water for the baby's milk, and when he spoke up, the way the staff reacted left the whole room in stunned silence. My dad asked for hot water for the baby's milk. Thinking a simple request would be met with service, they broke his wrist for raising his voice, unaware that every action would spark a reckoning the airline never expected. The moment the bones snapped, their arrogance began to crumble. Subscribe. If you believe cruelty always collapses when real authority rises. The moment Darian Morrow pressed the call button for the second time, he felt the subtle shift in atmosphere, like a cabin sealed too tight with something unspoken. He sat in seat 12A, his 6-month-old son, Kalen, nestled in the crook of his left arm, fussing quietly. The insulated bottle bag rested at his feet, still zipped, still cold. Darian had asked once, politely, for hot water to warm the milk. The request had been met with a nod, nothing more, from a tall, broad-shouldered flight attendant with a name tag that read Redden Vale. Now, several minutes later, there was still no water, and Kalen's soft discomfort was becoming restless squirming. The infant's whimper was muffled against Darian's sweater, but it pierced the father's focus like a siren. He didn't want to make a fuss. That wasn't who he was. He had boarded the Helion Air Flight 729 with quiet efficiency. His goal, simple: reach Crestfall City without incident. Yet, as Redden finally reappeared in the aisle, his posture was already defensive, his brow creased, his stride sharp. "You pressed the button again," Redden said flatly, his voice low but laced with reprimand. Darian blinked, surprised by the tone. "Yes, I'm sorry. I was just following up on the hot water I asked for earlier, for the baby's milk." Redden's eyes dropped briefly to the child, then back to Darian with a look that suggested inconvenience more than understanding. "You'll have to be patient," he said, and without waiting for a response turned on his heel and walked away. Darian stared at the back of the man's uniform, his own pulse ticking faster. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't been rude, and yet the reaction felt disproportionate and strangely personal. He glanced around the cabin. A few passengers looked his way and then quickly turned away. No one had spoken, but something in their eyes said they saw it too. From the galley up front, another attendant leaned in. This one, Darian would later learn, was named Malvek Dorn. He whispered something to Redden. Darian couldn't make out the words, but he saw the shift. Redden's posture stiffened. His jaw clenched. Malvek didn't even pretend not to look. He stared directly at Darian and the infant in his arms, his expression unreadable but cold. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't indifference. It was closer to irritation. Resentment, maybe. Kalen let out a louder cry. Tiny fists balled against Darian's chest. "I know, buddy," Darian whispered, rocking him gently. "We'll get you fed soon, okay?" The cabin was mostly settled now, cruising toward its final altitude, and yet no one from the crew had come back. No cart noises, no service, no small talk between rows. Only an eerie quiet broken by engine hums and Kalen's soft whimpers. Darian could feel it in his gut. This wasn't about a delay. It was about something else. He looked toward the front. Redden was walking down the aisle again, passing by each row without a tray or cup. When he neared 12A, Darian raised a hand slightly. "Excuse me, about the water." Redden didn't stop. He didn't even look directly at him. Instead, he muttered just loud enough to be heard. "We'll get to it. Don't rush us." Darian paused. The words weren't aggressive, but they were deliberate, meant to sting, or at least to warn. He nodded slowly, even though he had done nothing wrong. "Understood." A man across the aisle briefly glanced up from his magazine. His brow furrowed. Darian caught the glance, gave a small, composed smile in return. It was the kind of silent acknowledgement two strangers exchanged when something felt off, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the plane leveled, casting long shadows across the rows. Darian shifted Kalen in his arm and gently bounced him, hoping to soothe the child while avoiding further attention. The bottle bag remained unopened at his feet, useless without heat. From the front, Malvek and Redden appeared to be speaking again, this time with subtle gestures. Their eyes flicked toward the cockpit, then back toward Darien. Something about the synchronization made his stomach turn. It wasn't paranoia. Darien had worked in environments where coded glances and rehearsed power plays were common, but never in a place like this, and never when his child was the unintentional trigger. He pressed the call button a third time. This time, no one came. The light above his seat glowed quietly for several minutes before timing out. No explanation. No response. Darien's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the slow, dawning awareness that something very wrong was unfolding, not just for him, but for his son. The request had never been complicated. He wasn't asking for special treatment, just hot water. He bent his head, whispered softly to Kaylin, "It's okay, Daddy's trying." But even he wasn't sure how to try anymore without escalating what felt like a performance from the crew. He considered standing, walking to the galley, but something about Malvek's earlier glance warned against that. The rules would not protect him here. Not tonight. Not with this crew. A faint mechanical chime announced the beginning of a beverage service from the opposite end of the cabin. Redden and Malvek didn't move. They remained at the front, talking softly, occasionally glancing toward 12A as if studying something more than a man holding a baby. The tension was silent, but palpable, like static before a lightning strike. Darien kept his head down, arms secure around Kaylin, mind racing through possibilities. Speak up again? Press the button? Ask another attendant? What if this time they accused him of being disruptive? The thought sent a chill through his spine, not because he feared confrontation, but because he feared how quickly the truth could be buried beneath performance. Passengers in nearby seats had begun whispering among themselves. One leaned toward his seatmate and pointed subtly toward Darien, as if to say, "Still no water?" Darien caught the glance, saw the disbelief, but no one intervened. Not yet. He leaned back slightly in his seat, muscles taut, heartbeat slow but firm. His mind shifted gears, not from father to fighter, but from passenger to strategist. Something had changed, and he needed to be ready. Something in the air felt ready to snap. "Why do you keep summoning us?" Malvek's voice snapped through the cabin air like a whip, sharp and unmistakably hostile. Passengers turned. Some leaned out from their seats, others simply froze. Darien glanced up, startled by the tone more than the words. He had pressed the call button again, just once, after Kaylin's soft cries began to escalate into distressed wails. The baby's fists trembled in the air, cheeks flushed with the frustrated hunger only a parent could interpret. The bottle, still cold, rested uselessly in the insulated pouch at Darien's side. He held his son tighter, rocking gently, trying to keep both the baby and the moment from unraveling. "I haven't received the hot water I requested," Darien replied, keeping his voice level. "That's all." Malvek didn't blink. His arms were crossed, stance wide, like a guard protecting territory rather than assisting passengers. His eyes scanned the surrounding rows, aware that people were listening. That didn't stop him. "You're raising your voice," Malvek said flatly, though Darien's tone had been quiet, perhaps even softer than before. Darien blinked. "I'm not." "That's 3 times," Malvek interrupted, as if ticking off imaginary offenses. His words weren't loud, but they were sharp and deliberate, each one a small stone laid in the foundation of a larger lie. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Attention began to settle into the aisle, like a fog no one could explain but everyone could feel. Redden Vale emerged from the galley at that moment, hands empty, expression unreadable. "We're busy," he said to no one in particular, eyes flicking toward Darien. "Can't leave the galley every time someone gets impatient." Darien glanced at the quiet aisle. No carts, no passengers standing, No emergencies. Just silence and rows of confused faces. "If it's a matter of time," Darian offered calmly, "I can walk to the galley. Just point me to the dispenser." "You're not allowed near service equipment," Malvek barked before Redden could answer. He stepped in closer, a clear block between Darian and the aisle. The physicality of the move was subtle but deliberate. From seat 4C, Jarek Venn noticed the exchange. His fingers moved quietly over his phone, screen tilted downward, camera rolling. He had seen enough in the last few minutes to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. He angled slightly, getting a better view of Darian, the baby, and the encroaching attendants. "Sir," Darian said, voice even, "I'm just asking for hot water. For my son." He bounced Kalen slightly, trying to soothe him. The infant's cries were soft, not yet full sobs, but enough to strain Darian's focus. One hand rocked the child while the other rested on the armrest, open and relaxed. Malvek didn't reply. Instead, he leaned toward Redden, whispering something with a glance toward the cockpit. Redden's jaw moved, as if clenching something bitter behind his lips. The two exchanged a look that did not belong to routine procedure. It belonged to strategy. The tension shifted from passive-aggressive to something colder, calculated. Darian could feel it. He had worked in boardrooms long enough to recognize when a narrative was being formed before his eyes, quietly, methodically, and without his participation. He scanned the faces of nearby passengers. Some were wide-eyed, others skeptical, but most just concerned. They too were watching the mood shift. "I'd like to speak to the lead attendant or captain," Darian said, maintaining his composure. "No need," Redden replied sharply. "We're handling it." "But you haven't handled anything," Darian answered, still steady. "It's been over 15 minutes. My son needs warm milk." "You're being disruptive," Malvek said, his tone deceptively calm, like a man writing a script aloud. "I'm holding a 6-month-old child. I've only asked for water." "That's not how it sounded to us," Redden added, eyes now flicking toward the ceiling panels, toward the cockpit audio system. He raised his voice slightly, enough to be picked up by cabin mics. Dramatic irony twisted like a blade. Darian remained calm while the attendants began shaping an alternate reality, one that sounded believable from a distance, if you didn't see the truth for yourself. If you didn't see the baby in his arms, the open hands, the still voice. From the corner of his eye, Darian noticed Jarek's phone subtly shift again. Another man across the aisle angled his own phone higher, pretending to adjust his seatbelt but capturing the scene as well. The energy shifted. No longer neglect. This was orchestration, deliberate provocation hidden behind procedure. "You've been flagged as needing monitoring," Malvek muttered. "What does that mean?" Darian asked, heart beginning to beat harder, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't just misunderstanding. It was something else. A predetermined script? A mistake? Or something worse? Redden leaned slightly closer, voice low. "You're drawing attention. That's not good." "For asking for hot water," Darian replied, now whispering too to avoid adding fuel to the staged accusations. "Is that what this is really about?" Neither answered. Instead, both turned away, walking together toward the galley. As they passed the cockpit door, Redden gestured subtly upward with his hand. A signal, not to Darian, but to whoever was inside. Darian looked down at Kalen. The baby's cries had softened, momentarily distracted by his father's voice. Darian cradled him tighter, shifting the baby to his chest. One thought anchored him. Don't escalate. Don't give them what they're trying to extract. From behind him, a passenger muttered, "This is insane." Another whispered, "What did he even do?" The narrative in the cabin was starting to fracture, between the lie being recorded up front and the truth unfolding in row 12. Malvek turned back one last time before disappearing behind the curtain. His eyes narrowed, as if calculating the next move. Darian exhaled slowly, adjusting Kaylin's blanket. The call button blinked softly above him, ignored again. The quiet in the cabin now felt charged, not with confusion, but anticipation. Everyone sensed it. Something was coming. Something more than a delay, more than a denial of water. And as Darian gently stroked his son's back, his eyes remained locked on the curtain ahead, mind already racing. The simplest request had somehow been twisted into a threat. Redden Vale returned to row 12 with nothing in his hands, no tray, no cup, no attempt at the simple request he had been asked twice to fulfill. Instead, he arrived with a tight jaw, eyes gleaming with manufactured authority, and a tone sharpened for performance. "You've created a disturbance," he announced loudly, projecting his voice so it reached the cockpit and every recording device wired to it. Darian blinked, momentarily stunned. "I haven't raised my voice," he replied, keeping his tone even, his arm gently rocking Kaylin, who had begun to stir again. "I've only asked for hot water, for my son's bottle." Redden leaned slightly closer. "We've warned you twice," he said, his volume climbing theatrically, "and you've continued to disrupt crew operations." A beat passed. Darian didn't speak, he just looked. The lie was obvious to him, but it was also clearly choreographed. He wasn't being spoken to. He was being spoken about, for an audience. His eyes shifted subtly to the ceiling vent above, behind which a cabin microphone surely hummed, capturing the slanted narrative Redden was carefully spinning. From the galley, Malvek Dorn emerged as if on cue, stepping into the aisle with his arms folded, nodding with fake solemnity as if corroborating a tragedy. "He's ignoring crew instructions," Malvek said to no one in particular, but loud enough for the cockpit to hear. "Second warning already logged." Darian's jaw flexed. It hit him. This wasn't incompetence. It was orchestration. He sat upright, adjusting the small insulated bottle bag beside his leg. "You've given me no water," he said plainly. "You've blocked me from walking to the galley, and now you're inventing—" "Sir, enough," Redden interrupted, raising a hand to silence him as though speaking to a threat, not a father holding a child. "You're escalating this." Kaylin stirred in his arms, fussing now, disturbed by the voices. Seat 4C shifted slightly. Jarek Venn, the man with sharp eyes and a quiet presence, leaned sideways in his chair and discreetly tapped his phone. The screen lit up, camera active, lens angled just over the seatback to capture the scene. His other hand gestured subtly to a man across the aisle, Devrin Cole, who nodded, reaching for his phone as well. The triangle of silent witnesses had formed. Still seated, Darian raised his free hand slightly, palm outward. "I'm not aggressive," he said. "I'm only trying to feed my child." That's when Redden lunged, not with rage, but with precision. He gripped Darian's raised hand at the wrist, twisting it sharply as if any protest must now be proof of resistance. "What are you doing?" Darian asked, his voice clipped, breath catching as pain shot up his forearm. Kaylin startled in his lap and let out a sharp cry. The shrill sound pierced the cabin, drawing more eyes, more gasps. "He's being aggressive," Redden shouted, squeezing tighter, theatrically leaning back as if struggling to contain a violent passenger, though Darian had never left his seat. Malvek stepped in from the side, lowering his voice just enough for dramatic effect. "He's resisting. We may need to restrain." Darian looked around. Passengers were frozen, unsure whether to intervene. But their eyes said it all. They had seen everything. They had heard everything. And they knew exactly who was lying. Still, Darian didn't lash out. He didn't yell. He didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted his body to the side, curving protectively around Kaylin, who now wailed in earnest. The child's cries echoed through the fuselage like an alarm too pure to be ignored. "Don't, please," Darian said, his breath catching. "I'm holding a baby." But Malvek was already reaching to his belt. Silver glinted in the soft blue overhead lights, restraint straps. "This is your last warning," Redden barked, his voice climbing even higher, calculated for the microphone behind the cockpit door. "We will subdue you." Passengers began to rise from their seats. One called out, "He didn't do anything." Another added, "He has a baby, for heaven's sake." Jarek's camera shifted angles to get Malvek's hands reaching. Across the aisle, Devrin turned on his flash to illuminate the moment. 2 angles now captured what words would soon twist. But inside the storm, Darian remained still, his instincts hardwired for the one thing that mattered, protecting Kaylin. He drew his child closer, tucking him under his chin, his voice still low despite the chaos erupting around him. "I'm not resisting," he said again, softer this time. Malvek moved first. Redden followed. They didn't go for the baby. They went for the man. 2 hands reached toward Darian's forearms. One clasped, the other began to twist. In that final moment, time slowed. The entire cabin breathed in, and Darian spoke once more, not to them, but into the moment. "Please, I'm holding a baby." But his quiet warning went unheard. Redden moved first. Without a word, he lunged across the aisle and seized Darian's right wrist with a grip far too tight for any reasonable intent. The twist was swift, brutal, so sudden that Darian barely had time to react. His body arched instinctively, curling protectively around the small bundle in his left arm. Kaylin let out a sharp, frightened cry as his father's weight shifted, the familiar comfort of his father's hold disrupted by the sudden violence. A second later, Malvek joined in, pressing down on Darian's forearm as if subduing a violent threat. But there was no threat, only a father clutching his baby, eyes wide with disbelief, trying to shield his child from harm, even as his own body bore the assault. "Please," Darian said through clenched teeth, voice barely above a whisper, "I'm holding a baby." But Redden didn't stop. His fingers dug deeper into Darian's wrist, the angle unnatural. Then came the sound, horrible, unmistakable, a sharp crack that echoed across row 12. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a wave. A woman in 10B stood abruptly. A man near the emergency exit shouted, "What are you doing?" Darian cried out, not in rage but in raw pain. His wrist buckled under the pressure and his body sagged to the side. Yet somehow, even in that moment, he never let Kaylin slip. He shifted the infant closer to his chest, guarding him with the curve of his back, his injured arm limp and swelling. Kaylin, sensing distress, let out a high-pitched wail, pure, terrified sound that tore through the tension like glass shattering on tile. Malvek, breath heavy, shouted over the chaos, "Stop resisting!" But Darian hadn't moved except to protect. His restraint was unmistakable, and that's what made it all the more unbearable to witness. "Stop! He's not even resisting," a passenger called out, his voice rising. "Someone record this," yelled another. Jarek Venn was already ahead of them. The camera on his phone shook for a moment as he adjusted his seatbelt and rose slightly, angling for a better shot. Across the aisle, a young man handed him his phone, offering a second perspective. Jarek didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on the frame, documenting every second, his thumb hovering over the screen like a silent vow. Redden finally stepped back, his own breath ragged as if he'd just emerged from a struggle. But there had been no struggle, only performance. His face bore the exaggerated flush of fabricated exertion, his hands trembling not from effort but from being caught. He looked around, expecting compliance, but what he found were open mouths, disbelieving stares, and several phones raised like silent witnesses. Malvek reached for his radio and muttered rapidly, "Passenger in 12A assaulted crew. Repeat, we're initiating restraint protocol. Cockpit copy." His words collided with reality like oil on water. Passengers turned on him instantly. "That's a lie. We saw everything. He never touched you." Darian said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight it seemed fused, the muscles of his neck taut with the effort not to collapse from the pain. His right wrist hung useless, the swelling already blooming beneath his sleeve. But his left arm remained strong, firmly cradling the baby who now sobbed into his shirt. "It's okay, I'm here," he whispered softly into Kaylin's ear, his voice a fragile thread of calm amid the chaos. Somewhere behind him, an elderly man pressed the flight attendant call button repeatedly. A woman stood in the aisle, hands out, blocking Malvek from stepping any closer. "You hurt him while he was holding a baby," she said. "Do you even understand what you just did?" But Malvek ignored her. He didn't look at Darian either. His eyes were on the cockpit door. Jarek's camera caught the glint of metal near Malvek's waist, a set of restraint straps reflective under the cabin lights. He zoomed in, documenting every frame. From the back of the cabin, a voice called, "Get the captain out here, now!" But the door remained closed. Darian remained seated, his breathing uneven, his eyes shut for a long moment as he leaned back into the headrest. Every nerve screamed in his arm, but he kept his voice steady. He knew what this looked like, what they were trying to make it look like. He had seen it before. He just hadn't expected to become the headline. Passengers kept shouting. Some stood in defiance, others filmed silently. But no one backed down. In the narrow corridor near the galley, Redden whispered something to Malvek. Too low to hear, but the way Malvek stiffened said it all. They were recalibrating, calculating their next move. But they were too late. The damage was done. The act was seen. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. Jarek lowered the phone and glanced around at the other passengers. For the first time, they were all aligned, not as travelers, but as witnesses. Darian's head turned slowly toward the front of the plane. He wasn't looking for help anymore. He was preparing. He could feel it in the air, the narrative being written in real time, the lie crawling toward the cockpit, slithering through wires and whispered reports. It was no longer just about him or his son. It was about truth, and it was about to go to war with everything pretending to be order. The moment the lie touched the cockpit, the real fight began. Unruly male passenger became combative after multiple warnings. Baby unharmed, restraint administered. That was the official statement typed into Helion Air's incident report system just 15 minutes after Darian Morrow's wrist had been fractured. Captain Maren Drossen sat inside the cockpit reviewing the brief report on the overhead screen, brows furrowed. The language was clinical, detached, almost rehearsed. He scanned it twice, then a third time, searching for anything that felt human. There was none. Multiple warnings? Combative? He hadn't heard a single raised voice in the cabin, yet the report made it sound like a crisis had been averted. Still, protocol demanded he defer to the flight attendant's version of events, unless evidence suggested otherwise. He exhaled through his nose, uneasy. 3 rows behind the incident, someone had already taken a stand. Jarek Venn, in seat 4C, quietly tapped Upload on his phone. The video he had captured, 2 minutes long, shaky but clear, showed everything. Darian's calm request, his visible restraint, and the brutal moment when his wrist cracked under Redden's grip. Jarek didn't send it to social media, not yet. Instead, he uploaded it directly to a secure complaint portal used by passengers to report crew misconduct. He didn't stop there. Years ago, he'd worked in legal compliance, and old habits resurfaced like muscle memory. He copied the footage to a backup drive, added timestamps, and forwarded it to the National Oversight Group for Aviation Conduct. He didn't look like a hero, just a man with a quiet sense of duty and a sharp eye for when power was being abused. Meanwhile, Darian sat in silence, the pain in his wrist now pulsing like a drumbeat beneath his skin. Kaylin, startled by the earlier violence, whimpered against his father's chest. Darian rocked him gently with his uninjured arm, whispering, "You're okay, little one. You're okay." Across the aisle, a young man named Devrin Cole leaned forward. "Sir, I can hold him for a second, just while you catch your breath." Darian didn't raise his voice, but his reply was firm. "No one takes him from me again." Devrin nodded and sat back, his expression sobered by the finality in Darian's tone. It wasn't just protection. It was principle. No one would separate him from his son. Not after what had just happened. Not after hands that should have helped had instead caused harm. Redden and Malvek hovered a few feet away, speaking in low voices near the galley. Malvek chuckled once, muttering about passenger misconduct paperwork and another internal strike. He had no idea that his smirk was being recorded again, this time by a man near the front row who had only just begun filming after witnessing the earlier violence. Unbeknownst to the crew, the story had already slipped from their hands. In seat 7D, a man closed his magazine and quietly adjusted his posture. His name was Bren Voss. Unlike others on board, he wasn't a tourist, a businessman, or a nervous flyer. He was a federal flight marshal flying in plain clothes, assigned to a separate case. He hadn't planned to intervene, but the moment he saw the crew's report on the internal terminal screen and compared it to what he'd just seen and heard, he stood. Without a word to any passenger, he made his way to the cockpit, badge concealed, voice even. "Captain Drossen," he said quietly, "you need to see something before you let this incident proceed further." Drossen glanced over, surprised. "Who are you?" Voss opened his wallet just far enough to flash the badge. "Independent assignment. Not related to your flight, but I was present for the altercation. I've seen footage from 2 passengers. Your crew's report doesn't match what happened." The captain leaned back in his seat, now fully alert. "Define doesn't match." No threats, no raised voices. The passenger's wrist was fractured while holding a baby. "I suggest you delay any final entries into the system until you review everything." Drossen stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Get me the video." Back in row 12, Darian adjusted Kalen against his shoulder. His body throbbed with pain, but his mind stayed razor-sharp. He wasn't angry. He was observant. Every movement around him, every glance from the attendants, every phone lifted by passengers, he was tracking it all. This wasn't over, but it was beginning to tilt. Redden walked by again, slower this time, peering at the baby as though inspecting a package. Darian didn't flinch, but his gaze locked onto the man with quiet strength. There was no fear, only awareness. Redden didn't meet his eyes for long. He turned away, jaw tight, muttering something under his breath about escalation forms. Darian whispered again to Kalen, "I didn't come here to fight, but I won't let this go." In the cockpit, the first video finished playing. Captain Drossen leaned forward, silent. He replayed the section where Darian was seated calmly, asking for water. Then, the moment where both attendants closed in. The crack of the wrist. The baby's cry. The crew shouting, "Stop resisting," when there was clearly no resistance. He turned to Voss, voice low but tight. "Did you see this in real time?" "I saw enough, and I've confirmed the second angle shows the same sequence." Drossen looked down at the official report again, then back at the screen. "This doesn't line up, at all." Voss nodded once. "No, it doesn't." Drossen closed the report window without saving. The cabin wasn't just dealing with an incident. It was on the verge of a scandal. Darian hadn't spoken another word to the crew, nor raised his voice once. And yet, somehow, they had managed to paint him as the aggressor. He sat now with his son in one arm and a broken wrist in the other, surrounded by passengers who knew the truth but had no authority, and crew who had authority but no truth. Justice wasn't done yet, but the first domino had fallen. He didn't raise his voice, but they raised their hands. The moment the aircraft doors opened, the atmosphere shifted from tense silence to a rush of coordinated movement. Medical personnel boarded first, their footsteps urgent as they swept down the aisle toward row 12. Airport security followed closely behind, forming a line that split the cabin in 2. Before anyone could speak, Redden Vale stepped forward, pointing aggressively at Darian as if announcing a threat. "That's him, the passenger in 12A. he declared, his voice sharp and rehearsed. "He needs to be detained for aggression toward crew." His words echoed down the narrow aisle, bouncing off overhead panels and stiffening the air like static. But almost instantly, the response from passengers crashed over his accusation. A chorus of voices rose, overlapping in emotion and disbelief. "He didn't do anything," one man shouted from the opposite row, leaning forward with his phone still in hand. "We have video," another insisted, raising his screen high enough for security to see the paused footage. The security team faltered, glancing between the flustered crew and the outraged passengers, confusion pulling their brows tight. Their radios crackled softly, mirroring the uncertainty now gripping the aisle. Captain Maren Drossen stepped out of the cockpit with a cautious expression, his hands slightly raised as if bracing for turbulence. He scanned the cabin, taking in the fractured mood before moving toward the cluster forming around row 12. But just as he reached the scene, a figure emerged between the rows, Agent Bren Voss, still in plain clothes, his badge tucked discreetly inside his jacket. He lifted a hand to stop the captain. "Captain," he said calmly, though his voice carried weight, "I need you to see something before any decisions are made." Voss unlocked his phone and turned the screen toward him. Jarek Ven's recording played with stark clarity, Darien sitting calmly, cradling his infant son, while Redden and Malvek initiated the confrontation. Then came the moment of force, the twist, the cry, the break. Drossen's face shifted, the color draining as the truth replaced the script he had been fed moments earlier. Before he could look away, Voss swiped to reveal another angle, Devrin's matching clip, captured from across the aisle. Two different angles. One truth. The captain exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling on him. He looked up at Redden, whose shoulders stiffened under the scrutiny. "Did he ever threaten you?" Drossen asked, his tone no longer neutral. The question hung in the air like a suspended blade. Redden opened his mouth, but hesitation cracked through his confidence. His eyes darted toward the back of the cabin, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Meanwhile, Darien stood quietly beside his seat, still holding Kalen close to his chest. His face had gone pale from the throbbing pain in his wrist, but his posture remained steady, his voice composed. When the paramedic reached him, Darien lifted his injured arm just enough to show the swelling. "They twisted it backward while I was feeding my son," he said softly. His calmness struck harder than any accusation. The paramedic's eyes widened, then softened with understanding. Kalen let out a soft coo, pressing his cheek against Darien's chest, completely unaware of the chaos surrounding him. The simple sound cut through the tension, drawing the attention of several passengers who had been trembling with anger moments before. The innocence of the child made the cruelty of the incident feel even sharper. Passengers stepped forward, their voices steadier now. One man raised his hand. "I saw everything." He never raised his voice. Another added, "The crew kept provoking him. They refused to help the baby." Their accounts aligned effortlessly, forming a barrier of truth that the crew could no longer push through. At the rear of the cabin, airport supervisors arrived, whispering into radios as they tried to make sense of the conflicting reports. One supervisor leaned toward another and murmured, "We already have multiple complaints filed from the air." The words carried a quiet finality, foreshadowing a shift none of the hostile crew members had anticipated. Across the aisle, Malvek Dorn made a subtle move toward the back exit, lowering his head as if disappearing into the crowd might erase what had happened. But an airport officer stepped into his path before he could escape, blocking him with a firm hand on his shoulder. Malvek froze, his eyes widening as he realized the situation had turned against him completely. He was separated from Redden and guided to the opposite side of the cabin for questioning. Darien watched all of this unfold, not with triumph, but with a steady, exhausted clarity. The truth had finally taken shape around him, supported by voices, footage, and the undeniable innocence of the child in his arms. He breathed in slowly, grounding himself as the chaos began to bend toward justice. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the paramedics prepared to escort him out, and for a brief moment the entire plane seemed to hold its breath, caught between what the crew tried to claim and what the passengers had proven. The captain lowered his gaze, recognizing the integrity he should have shown earlier. Agent Voss nodded to Darian, a gesture of respect without words, and in the settled quiet that followed, the truth stood unshakable. When lies land before the plane does, there's no runway long enough to cover them. Darian Morrow sat upright in the emergency room at Crestfall Medical, his wrist swollen and discolored, the pain a dull roar beneath his otherwise composed demeanor. His 6-month-old son, Kalen, shifted gently in the crook of his good arm, unaware of the storm that had followed them off Flight 729. A nurse approached with a clipboard, asking for details to begin treatment. Darian shook his head once, firmly. "I'll fill it out," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But someone needs to hold my son, someone I can trust." At that moment, Agent Bren Voss stepped forward from the corner where he had been silently observing. The plainclothes federal marshal had already intervened once during the disembarkation, subtly but decisively, ensuring Darian wasn't wrongfully detained by security. Without a word, Bren removed his badge from the lanyard around his neck and placed it on the counter in front of Darian as a sign of respect. Then he held out both arms. Darian hesitated, his eyes scanning Voss's face, searching for even a flicker of condescension or judgment. He found none. Gently, he transferred Kalen into Voss's arms. "He likes to be held upright," Darian murmured. "I've got him," Voss replied, adjusting the baby with careful hands, his posture protective and calm. Around them, the ER buzzed with late-night tension, beeping monitors, the occasional groan of a patient, the soft shuffle of nurses. But in their small circle, time briefly slowed. Minutes later, Darian sat with a physician and 2 administrators as they examined his wrist. The X-rays showed a hairline fracture in the radius and evidence of severe ligament strain. The doctor winced as he reviewed the scan. "This didn't happen by accident," he said, looking up. "That much is clear." In a separate office just down the corridor, a young legal liaison from Helion Air read a prepared statement over the phone. An isolated onboard disagreement was managed by the crew, using standard protocol. He barely got through the sentence before Jarek Ven's video clips began making rounds online, edited versions showing the entire sequence of events, from the initial polite request for hot water to the moment of physical force, spread like wildfire. Hashtags ignited in real time, hashtag hot water fracture, hashtag 729witness, and simply, hashtag 12A. Within hours, the story took on a life of its own. Independent analysts, some aviation experts, some lawyers, some just angry fathers, began breaking the footage down frame by frame. One well-known commentator paused the video precisely when Redden Vale twisted Darian's wrist and asked aloud to his followers, "Where's the aggression they claimed?" Back at the hospital, Darian turned down all requests for interviews. Camera crews waited outside, but he remained inside, cradling Kalen once again. His lawyer, Elias Wren, arrived with an exhausted but impressed expression. "It's already everywhere," Elias said, setting his laptop bag down beside the hospital bed. "They didn't just lose control of the narrative, they lit a match next to jet fuel." Darian didn't look up. He was gently feeding Kalen from the bottle now warmed properly by a nurse. His voice was low and tired, but steady. "Every second of that flight my son needed warm milk," he said. "Not once did I stop asking for it. I just didn't expect to need legal firepower to get it." The baby cooed softly, finishing the last of the bottle. The moment should have been quiet. Instead, the hospital lobby erupted in new whispers. A former Helion Air employee had posted an anonymous comment under one of the trending videos, alleging that Redden Vale had been named in a similar misconduct complaint back in 2021. That case, the commenter said, had been internally sealed. A local reporter picked up the thread. Within an hour, screenshots surfaced confirming that such a complaint existed. The Regulatory Oversight Group reopened the case immediately. The implication was clear. Redden hadn't snapped under pressure. He had a history. Bren Voss, still seated in the hallway just outside the room, rocked Kalen gently and listened as news notifications buzzed on his phone. He didn't react, didn't smile or frown, but he knew what this meant. He stood, peeked in through the small window in the door, and saw Darian resting his head back on the pillow, eyes closed but still alert beneath heavy lids. Outside, 2 federal regulators waited to speak with Elias. One of them, a sharp-featured man in his 50s, held a printed transcript of passenger testimonies gathered from private forums. The last line stood out in yellow highlighter. He never raised his voice. They just didn't like what it represented. Back in the room, Darian opened his eyes slowly and looked down at his sleeping son. He didn't need to see the headlines to understand the path ahead. He already felt it in his bones, both the broken one and the one that refused to bend under pressure. He reached toward the side table with his good hand and quietly scribbled something in the incident statement form. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but every word was deliberate. Later that evening, a representative from the Aviation Safety Board called Elias directly. They didn't ask for media cooperation. They didn't warn about confidentiality. They asked one question. Would Mr. Morrow be willing to attend an in-person debrief with our Federal Review panel? Elias relayed the request. Darian looked out the window, the city lights of Crestfall gleaming in distant clusters. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said aloud, mostly to himself, "A baby's cry exposed the quiet violence grown men still pretend doesn't exist." The staff smirked, confident their position would shield them, unaware that every camera, every witness, and every policy violation had already aligned against them. The father's calm strength had already turned their abuse into proof of wrongdoing. If you believe oppression under uniform always folds when strategy meets resolve, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Let's flag him as non-compliant. He's stalling us. The words, caught on an internal cabin mic, hovered in the air like a match poised over dry tinder. The Crestfall Transportation Tribunal began its review the moment the Helion Air Legal Division forwarded the crew's version of the incident. It was bland, procedural, and riddled with evasive language. Passenger in 12A displayed elevated tension and failed to comply with crew directives. Restraint was administered for cabin safety. Infant remained unharmed. But what they didn't know, what no one anticipated, was that the airline's own internal surveillance, usually locked down unless needed to defend staff conduct, would be their undoing. The footage, reviewed in a sterile, windowless room by 3 senior tribunal analysts, began innocuously. Darian Morrow, one arm gently rocking his infant son, flagged down Redden Vale with quiet civility. No shouting, no escalation, only a soft request for hot water, once, then again. Then the wait, then the refusal, then Malvek Dorn stepping in, arms folded, posture aggressive, lips tight. "Rewind that part," said Tribunal Chair Merrick Voslin, a man whose calm demeanor often made younger investigators uneasy. They scrubbed back. Malvek leaned to whisper. A microphone mounted just above the galley caught it. "Let's flag him as non-compliant. He's stalling us." Voslin sat back. There it is. The room fell still. The very label meant to justify restraint had been planted before any struggle existed. A manipulation of protocol, deliberate, practiced. Worse, Darian had no idea it was coming. Next came the audio. Voslin ordered the full cabin channel logs released and isolated. What they found there defied the official report. They heard Darian's voice, level, composed, saying, "Please be gentle, I'm holding my son." Seconds before a sudden crack shot through the speakers. A sharp intake of breath followed. Then the baby's wail. Voslin flinched. That'll be enough? He didn't need to hear more. Across town, Darian sat in the quiet of his apartment, his arm in a brace, his son sleeping soundly beside him. The swelling had gone down, but the ache lingered, not just in his wrist, but in the space between what he knew happened and what the airline claimed did. He avoided news coverage, declined requests for interviews, and let his attorney filter every call. His focus remained on Kaylin, but the world was moving without him. Jarek Venn's silent footage had become more than evidence. It was a signal. On forums, in quiet advocacy groups, and on internal whistleblower boards, it spread like a spark catching wind. Passengers from Flight 729 who had filmed the incident began to connect, forming a small but firm coalition ready to testify if needed. Some had never intended to get involved until they realized silence would make them complicit. One of them, Devrin Cole, submitted his footage anonymously. It matched Jarek's from a different angle, showing clearly that Darian had been stationary, defensive, and visibly trying to shield his child. It also showed the moment Redden twisted his wrist. No struggle, no retaliation. Just the sickening sound of bone yielding to pressure. Meanwhile, Healy and Air scrambled to get ahead of the storm. Their legal team submitted a half-page clarification to the tribunal, suggesting that some misunderstandings may have occurred and promising internal review. But the footage was now in the hands of the tribunal, not to mention shared on encrypted channels among federal oversight staff. The airline couldn't control the narrative anymore. A week into the investigation, Darian received an unexpected visitor. A federal attorney named Marcus Trenn, sent not to negotiate, but to inquire. Trenn arrived without entourage or threat. He simply sat across from Darian, removed his glasses, and said, "We believe this may not be the only incident involving these crew members." Darian, still cradling Kaylin in one arm, blinked slowly. "You think there are others?" "We've received partial testimony from a man who flew last year with his infant daughter. No video, no witnesses willing to come forward. He said he was denied formula water, that he was nearly removed from the plane for verbal escalation." Darian exhaled. "What happened?" "It was buried. Quiet settlement. But your case reopens that door." Darian didn't reply. He simply looked down at Kaylin's sleeping face. There was no anger in his eyes, only clarity. He finally asked, "What exactly do you want from me?" "We'd like you to testify in a broader misconduct investigation, not just about your flight, but about a pattern." Darian nodded slowly, then said, "Let me think about it." Trenn didn't press further. He rose, left his card, and quietly saw himself out. Back at the tribunal offices, Voslin compiled a formal summary of the findings. He didn't embellish. He didn't editorialize. He simply wrote what the evidence confirmed. No threats made, no verbal escalation, no non-compliance. Just a father, asking more than once for hot water, a whisper between attendants, a choice to redefine civility as defiance, and a child caught in the center of it all. Jarek Venn, now referred to in media circles as the silent witness, never once spoke to reporters. But his quiet action, filming without interrupting, was now being used in training seminars about civilian oversight and passive intervention. When asked privately if he regretted recording, he simply shook his head. "If I hadn't," he said, "they'd have gotten away with it again." As the tribunal scheduled formal hearings, new names began to surface. Passengers from unrelated flights recalled similar tones, similar refusals, the same faces. The investigation began to widen, like a single crack spidering through glass, revealing the web of quiet aggression that had remained hidden for too long. And Darian, still recovering, still silent, found himself drawn toward something he never sought. A fight not for justice alone, but for change. What he didn't know yet, what no one did, was how far that change would reach. But it had begun, quietly, powerfully. because what began with hot water now boiled into something no airline was ready for. 6 days after the incident, Darian Morrow sat in his apartment's modest living room, the evening light casting long, soft shadows across the quiet room. Kaylin was asleep on his chest, a warm bundle of trust and peace, unaware of the storm that still lingered just beyond the front door. A knock at that door had not come, but the envelope had. It lay on the coffee table in front of him, ivory-colored, heavy with implication. The embossed logo of Helionair's legal department sat at the top left corner like a seal of silence. He didn't move for several minutes. His lawyer, Elias Wren, sat across from him, elbows on his knees, watching him with quiet patience. When Darian finally opened the envelope, the pages unfolded like a trap disguised as reconciliation. The letter offered a formal apology. It offered medical compensation for the wrist fracture, lifetime flight vouchers, and, most notably, a joint public statement drafted with the airline's PR department. But it also included one unmissable condition. He must agree never to pursue legal action or testify publicly. The line was bolded, emotionless, and final. The silence in the room deepened. Darian didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked down at Kaylin's sleeping face, his features soft and peaceful, as if none of it had ever happened. His wrist still throbbed faintly, a phantom reminder of the force used against him while protecting the child now breathing gently against his chest. The paper in his hand weighed far more than its pages. It wasn't just an offer, it was a request to forget. Elias leaned forward. It's a strong offer, considering the footage went viral. They're scared. That's why they want a settlement fast. Darian didn't look up. If this were your son, he asked, voice low but steady, would you sign it? Elias exhaled through his nose. No, he admitted. I wouldn't. Darian folded the letter slowly, pressing its edges cleanly. He didn't tear it. He didn't curse. He simply set it back on the table and said, then let's not pretend it was ever an option. His tone was final. His mind had already moved forward. The next morning, Darian requested a formal hearing with the Transportation Tribunal and the National Aviation Oversight Board. He didn't frame it as a complaint. He framed it as an opportunity for reform. The panel met a week later in a government building with tall, frosted windows and solemn wood-paneled walls. The senior investigator, Bren Vos, presided over the session, flanked by regulatory analysts and compliance officers. The room felt clinical, but beneath its structure burned a growing awareness that something was changing. Darian stood alone at the podium. He wore no cast, only a discreet compression brace. His shirt sleeves were buttoned, his tone measured. No outrage, no theatrics, only facts. I didn't raise my voice, he began. I didn't make threats. I asked for hot water for my infant son. I was ignored, then accused, then injured. He paused. The injury wasn't the worst part. The silence from those who saw it coming. That was worse. Voss watched him carefully. So did the other panel members. Darian continued, recounting the timeline, each moment grounded in evidence already reviewed by the tribunal. He didn't speculate. He didn't dramatize. He simply allowed the weight of what happened to settle in the room like dust after impact. Then the twist came. A man sitting at the back of the room raised his hand, an observer, not a scheduled speaker. He introduced himself as Caleb Brenner, a father of a 2-year-old who had flown with Helionair just 3 months prior. The room hushed. I didn't plan to speak, he said, clearing his throat. But I saw the video online, and what Mr. Morrow described, it happened to me, too. Same route, same issue, different result. He paused. I didn't film anything. No one did. My complaint was buried. No one followed up. The silence cracked open wider. Panelists turned to each other, whispering. Malvek's name was mentioned again, this time tied to both incidents. Bren Voss tapped his pen once against his notes. the sound loud in the quiet chamber. A connection had been made, and it hadn't come from evidence or strategy. It came from the quiet courage of one man making space for another. When the hearing resumed, Voss leaned toward the microphone and said, "This testimony highlights a dangerous blind spot in current policies, particularly when it comes to how flight crews are trained to handle passengers traveling with infants. The question now is, are we willing to fix it?" Darian didn't interrupt. He didn't even nod. He stood still, knowing that the words were already bigger than him. As the session drew to a close, Darian was asked if he had any final thoughts. He looked at the row of faces before him, some skeptical, some attentive, all now carrying the burden of what they'd heard. He stepped up to the mic one last time. "This wasn't about hot water," he said. "It was about cold silence from those who should have helped." His voice didn't shake. The ones who didn't shout became the loudest voices in the room. The knock came like a warning. Not at Darian's front door, but on Helion Air's public news bulletin, an internal memo leaked late that morning announcing a new procedural overhaul. It was precise, clinical in tone, but heavy with implication. Effective immediately. All frontline crew will undergo quarterly de-escalation training. Passenger complaint triage systems will be updated. A new real-time escalation protocol is to be implemented, specifically for incidents involving infant passengers. This initiative will operate under the internal code name, the Kalen Directive. The name hit Darian like a quiet thunderclap, not because he had asked for it, but because he hadn't. By mid-afternoon, the sun had stretched long across his living room floor. Kalen, now 8 months old, napped nearby in a cushioned rocker. Darian sat at his dining table, one arm still recovering in a soft brace, as he read through a formal invitation from the Civil Aviation Board. It was addressed not to Mr. Morrow, but to Mr. Darian Morrow, passenger witness advocate, voluntary. They wanted him to help shape the Kalen Directive from the inside. The air around him felt still, controlled. He tapped the letter once, then again, as if testing its reality. Finally, he made a single note in the margin. No title. Feedback only. Transparency clause non-negotiable. His reply was brief and measured. He thanked them for the invitation but declined the official position. "I'll contribute where I can," he wrote, "but I will not be the face of something that should have existed before my son ever boarded your plane." Elsewhere, however, names were being carved out in less noble tones. Redden Vale's termination came with a single line from the airline. Dismissed following internal review of personnel conduct. No press release. No apology. But insiders leaked the memo. It listed 3 previously sealed complaints, 2 involving similar aggression, 1 involving falsified cabin reports. All buried, all quiet, until now. Malvek Dorn's resignation wasn't labeled disciplinary, but the words irreconcilable internal disagreement made it clear. Rumors circulated that he'd clashed with Captain Marendrossen in a closed-door meeting 2 days prior. Some said voices were raised, others claimed the captain had slammed his crew report onto the table and walked out without signing it. That same evening, in the burnished silence of a tribunal hearing room, Drossen stood alone under the soft hum of overhead lights. The panel had called him for comment, not on procedure, but on conscience. Dressed in full uniform, he answered every question with formality, until the last one. "Captain," asked a member of the tribunal, "do you believe the situation could have been prevented had you left the cockpit and assessed the cabin directly?" There was no pause. "Yes," Drossen said. His voice was firm, but not loud. "I didn't listen. That mistake lives with me." There was no follow-up. There didn't need to be. The quote circulated that same night across news channels and forums. Some saw it as too little too late. Others, especially within training circles, marked it as the rarest of aviation confessions. An officer owning silence not with excuse, but with accountability. Darian read it hours later, phone in hand, thumb hovering above the article. He sat on the rooftop of their apartment, wind gentle, the night sky quiet above Crestfall City. Kaylin stirred in his arms, then settled again. He didn't speak for a while. When he did, it was for a reporter who caught him off guard the next morning outside the medical clinic where he was finishing wrist therapy. "Mr. Morrow, do you have a response to the captain's statement?" Darian didn't blink. He adjusted Kaylin's blanket and said clearly, without hesitation, "Owning a mistake is the first thing that separates a leader from a uniform." He turned without waiting for the next question. And as cameras clicked behind him, his final sentence echoed down the sidewalk like a quiet oath. "Reform doesn't begin when you get caught. It begins when you choose to change before you have to." The sound was unmistakable, sharp, sudden, and intimate. A crack, clean and cruel, like a branch snapping in the dead of winter. It echoed not through trees, but through a small cabin of metal and recycled air, captured not by accident, but by intention. In the dim glow of a living room screen, the footage replayed. Darian's voice, calm and low, just seconds before the sound, "Please be gentle. I'm holding my son." Then the crack. Then silence. Then his whispered promise, "It's okay, Daddy's got you." The documentary titled Row 12A didn't open with credits. It didn't need to. The footage itself introduced the story. Just 30 seconds of uncut reality, Darian's wrist breaking while cradling his infant son, juxtaposed with a lullaby track so soft it turned the scene into a surreal lull between pain and peace. Then fade to black. An independent media collective released the film without ceremony. No press release. No red carpet. Just a time-stamped drop on their platform, accompanied by a quiet caption. "Witness what restraint sounds like." The video climbed into the millions within days, not because of rage-baiting titles or viral stunts, but because of how raw and bare it was. Truth had found its own spotlight. Interviews intercut the footage, passengers from Flight 729, their voices steady, their eyes carrying the weight of that night. Jarek Venn appeared briefly, seated against a neutral background. "I didn't plan to film it," he said, fingers lightly tapping his phone on the table. "I just had a bad feeling." His recording had gone from quiet act to quiet revolution. No words needed, just the lens aimed where justice failed. A legal analyst broke down the inconsistencies in the crew's report. A trauma-informed psychologist explained what happens when power targets calmness, when silence is mistaken for guilt. "Sometimes," he said, "those who yell are seen as victims, and those who whisper become suspects, especially when they're holding a baby." And then Darian. No face, just voice. Off camera. Measured. Not seeking pity, offering clarity. "I asked for hot water," he said, "and I never stopped asking." His words came in fragments, edited carefully to protect what little privacy he had left. "They kept saying I was aggressive, but I wasn't even standing." But the twist came not from the footage. It came from a voice that wasn't in it. Midway through the documentary's release cycle, the creators received an encrypted tip through their anonymous line. A whistleblower, former Helion Air employee. The message was short, clinical, and loaded. He was flagged before he boarded. Internal profile note, potentially problematic passenger. Old data, booking error, should have been deleted. The producers cross-verified the claim, then included it in the closing segment. A screen recording showed a hidden line of code in the crew manifest software. A profile note, once triggered by a system flag 3 years earlier when Darian's seat had been accidentally double-booked during a storm delay. That old complaint was resolved, his record cleared, but the flag remained. Quiet, hidden, waiting to reframe a father as a threat before he ever asked for hot water. Dramatic irony coiled in full. The lie of his aggression didn't begin mid-flight, it was planted on the ground. The Aviation Oversight Board, already investigating Helion Air, took immediate notice. Their next move wasn't punishment, it was policy. Draft legislation began circulating for new data ethics laws. No flagged profiles without current, verified cause, no hidden notes, no silent branding of passengers based on outdated system errors. In the quiet of his apartment, Darian watched row 12A on a modest screen, sound low so Kaylin wouldn't wake. His son, now nearly walking, slept beside him, one hand loosely curled on a plush toy. The credits rolled. Darian didn't cry, didn't flinch, just listened. And when the final frame faded to black, when his own voice whispered back at him, captured forever, "It's okay, Daddy's got you," he turned off the screen. Then he leaned close to Kaylin, gently stroked his hair, and said aloud into the silence, "Let's make your world better than mine was." Some truths don't need to trend, they need to endure. Later that summer, the Aviation Authority issued its long-awaited announcement. Every major airline operating within national airspace would be required to fully implement the Kaylin Directive by December 31st. The news broke quietly at first, just a short line buried in a regulatory bulletin. But within hours, civil rights groups, aviation reform advocates, and industry analysts were circulating it with a mix of applause and disbelief. The directive, born from the aftermath of Helion Air Flight 729, was no longer just a company-specific policy. It was now federal mandate. And though Darian Morrow never asked for a spotlight, that spotlight was coming for him. His phone buzzed with a message from Elias Wren, his attorney. "You've been nominated," the text read. A second message followed. "Civil Rights Commission, lifetime contribution to passenger equity." Darian stared at the screen, unmoved. Kaylin babbled in the living room nearby, knocking over plastic blocks with joyous abandon. The noise grounded Darian in the present, messy, warm, ordinary. He stepped out onto the small apartment balcony and called Elias. "I'm not accepting it," he said simply. Elias sighed. "Are you sure? This is big." Darian's voice was quiet but firm. "If they want to honor someone, honor the father no one filmed, the one who didn't have Jarek Venn sitting 3 rows back." The call ended with understanding. 3 weeks later, a modest ceremony was held in Crest Falls City Hall. The award, now posthumously dedicated to a father whose complaint had been dismissed months before, was placed beside a framed still image from Flight 729. Not of Darian, but of the moment Jarek's camera first tilted into frame. Jarek Venn himself stood at the podium, awkward in a borrowed blazer, clutching folded notes in one hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I didn't know him," he said, "but I knew right from wrong. That's all it took." Murmurs of agreement moved through the room like soft wind. A few reporters glanced down, scribbling versions of the same line. After the ceremony, Jarek stood by the exit, shaking hands with guests. A journalist asked why he had started filming in the first place. "Honestly," he replied, "I'd never recorded anything before. I just had a bad feeling." His voice cracked slightly. "Something told me it wouldn't end right." The reporter wrote that down too, but the moment belonged more to memory than media. Meanwhile, at 3 separate aviation academies, training instructors played case study modules based on Flight 729. The footage had been sanitized, passenger faces blurred, cabin noise lowered, but the narrative was unchanged. One instructor paused the simulator mid-scene and addressed a room full of young men in uniform. "Don't look for yelling. Sometimes silence is louder." This father never raised his voice, but because of him, we all raised the standard. The trainees sat still. A few shifted uncomfortably. One wrote Kaylin Directive in bold across his training log. Back in Darian's apartment, the story unfolded in a far quieter way. He sat at his desk late into the night, not looking at headlines but organizing digital files into a clean, encrypted folder. He labeled it, "For Kaylin, when he's ready. Inside, he placed the tribunal transcripts, Jarek's original footage, letters from passengers, the rejected settlement offer, and that first medical x-ray of his fractured wrist. At the top of the folder, he wrote a single note. I protected you with more than my arms. And when your world tests you, let calm be your thunder. 3 years later, the sound of preschoolers laughing spilled out into the schoolyard like music on a spring breeze. Among them, a small boy with bright eyes and messy curls sprinted toward the gate with something clutched tightly in his hand. "Daddy!" he shouted. "Look, Daddy, it flies." His voice was filled with innocent triumph as he held up a slightly crumpled paper plane. Darian Morrow knelt instinctively, catching his son in a tight, fluid motion. Kaylin crashed into his arms, giggling. The paper plane fluttered between them as Darian scooped him up with ease, his right wrist long healed but never forgotten. He kissed the boy's head gently and held him close, the soft weight of fatherhood grounding him more than anything else ever had. Later that evening, the wind on the rooftop was gentle but constant, sweeping over the low buildings of their quiet neighborhood. City lights flickered below like distant landing strips. Darian stood beside the small metal railing, his son perched on a plastic stool beside him, tiny feet kicking the air. In Kaylin's hands was the same paper plane, now refolded with more care. "What makes it fly?" the boy asked, tilting his head. Darian looked out into the night sky, then down at his son. "Not all flights go as planned," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean you stop flying." Kaylin stared at him, absorbing the words, not fully understanding, but somehow knowing they mattered. He nodded and threw the paper plane into the breeze. It circled once, then dived, caught by a sudden gust before gliding back toward them like a quiet echo of a past long buried. The wind carried more than paper that night. Hundreds of miles away, in a brightly lit training facility, a new class of flight attendants sat in stiff-backed chairs arranged before a curved simulator screen. The simulation paused with a click. On screen was a reenactment of Flight 729, an anonymized reconstruction created from tribunal footage and edited audio logs. The room was still as the instructor, a middle-aged man with salt in his beard, stepped forward and pointed to the figure seated in seat 12A. "This man," he said, "never raised his voice, but he raised the standard." The trainees watched in silence as the screen flickered to a frame where a father, calm, injured but unwavering, held a crying baby while others panicked. It wasn't the drama that held their attention. It was the composure, the way the man shielded the child, the way he whispered instead of shouted. A trainee in the front row, barely 20, raised his hand. "Was it real?" he asked. The instructor nodded solemnly. "Every second of it, and we now train under a policy named after his son." Back on the rooftop, Kaylin's paper plane had landed near Darian's feet. The boy ran to fetch it, laughing. Darian crouched, watching him closely. His thoughts moved slowly, unlike the day of the incident, when every second had passed like a blade. The wrist that once cracked under pressure now bore no mark, but his memory did. He remembered the twist, the shout, the eyes of strangers rising in protest, the man named Jarek who silently filmed, the marshal who listened, and the baby, this boy, who had cried in his arms while he fought to stay composed. He hadn't told Kaylin the story yet. Someday, maybe, but not now. Downstairs, a tablet buzzed on the kitchen counter. An email from the Aviation Oversight Council had arrived with a training report attached. Flight 729, Case Study Compliance Summary, Quarter 4. Darian didn't check it. He already knew what it said. The legacy had moved beyond him. He looked up as Kaylin bounded back, breathless, paper plane in hand. "Again?" the boy asked. "Again," Darian said, kneeling down. He adjusted the wings slightly and showed Kaylin how to aim it higher. "Sometimes," he said, "you gotta give it more lift." The boy nodded seriously and sent it flying once more. In another state, a journalist editing a story paused as she reviewed a documentary clip. The footage rolled slowly. Darian Morrow's voice, steady as stone, played over an image of a baby asleep in his arms. Her editor stepped in and asked, "You sure we're ending it here?" She shook her head. "There's no better ending." Because the world didn't change when he broke, it changed because he didn't. By the time the incident was reported, investigations were underway, the crew frozen in disbelief and the airline facey. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, racism, and the courage it takes to stand up for loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and fairness in all situations.